In this episode of the podcast, we're talking to one of my old friends, Kalen Sharp. Now, Kalen is a web developer, an entrepreneur, as well as an educator, and he's probably best known for co-founding Dev Mountain. Dev Mountain is an in-person coding bootcamp that I believe has 4 different locations at this point, and it teaches programmers a 12-week condensed curriculum that essentially has them exiting ready for real-world jobs. Super impressive. Kalen actually sold off the company for $15 million and then moved on to his next venture, which is now Prenda, a new home-based microschooling venture, which is kind of great timing. Anyway, in this podcast, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We'll talk a little bit about my relationship with Kalen. We'll talk about kind of what it is to create something from the ground up. You're going to hear from Kalen's experiences and get plenty of advice along the way, which is honestly quite fantastic. Both of us being educators, we're also going to talk about education and the best ways to learn, also kind of the way that we look at our current educational system. On top of that, we might even get into a little bit of gaming because we both kind of love gaming. Let's go ahead and dive into the episode. This is the TSS Podcast. It's a place for authentic conversations to uncover the stupid, simple truths that help us succeed in business, create better relationships, and lead more fulfilling lives. Welcome to Think Stupid Simple. My friend, assume that I've already done your intro because that's going to be filmed.
That will happen. Okay, yeah, perfect.
Yeah. All right. My friend, welcome to the podcast. It has been a minute. I'm lighting a candle. This is how we start each episode, my friend. We get a little bit romantic. You said we can't talk about your sex life. That was actually my first line of questions. So I really don't know what to talk about now. Dude, when was the last time we talked?
I mean, I think I was in your neighborhood. Probably it had to have been at least 4 or 5 years ago, if not more. And like came and said hi, and you brought me by your studio at the time, gave me a little tour. It was probably like a much smaller operation than what you have going on. Yeah, it's been a long time, like multiple years.
It's been a while. I got to say, okay, so you've done all these really cool things since really last time that we had spoken. I think it's been about probably 5-6 years. Now, yeah. Interestingly, so our audience kind of gets an idea here. Kalen, our relationship kind of goes back all the way to basically college, right? Right out of college.
Almost, yeah. Right out of college.
And I don't know that I ever told you this. I don't know. There wasn't really necessarily a reason to, but we had a chance to work together on a couple projects. Kalen is a very well-known developer. Really, I would say one of the smartest people that I know, self-taught. We're going to get into all this kind of stuff in a minute. But anyway, we had a chance to kind of work on a project. And I remember you stepping away from that project. And I was like so incredibly bummed.
Oh, sad.
And I was like angry and sad and all the things. And I'm like, nope, I don't even want to talk to Kalen anymore.
Oh no.
I don't. Did you pick up on that at all?
I don't think I did. At least I don't remember that at all. I remember you guys starting to get into photography. Like you kind of, the next chapter seemed like it was, getting into photography, but I didn't sense that there was any kind of like sadness or anger or anything like that.
Yeah, we were working on, I think you were helping us with, we were starting to do development in terms of like photography based software as a service type stuff.
That's right.
And,
okay. I do remember that.
You left to go do, and I remember the conversation. It was a really positive conversation. It was mainly just like, you wanted to follow your dreams, and this wasn't like developing software in photography wasn't like your space, wasn't your thing. And you went on to create Dev Mountain. And the only thing was on my side was just like, I'd always dreamed of working with you like in a partnership. And I was like, I was really bummed about that because you're one of my favorite people. And then for a while, I couldn't get over it. Do you know when I got over it?
Yesterday, maybe?
It wasn't when I invited you onto the podcast. It wasn't then. No. So I actually got over it when you sold Dev Mountain.
Okay. You're like, I can see why
it wasn't so much that I could see, like, well, first, I didn't have any context for how big Dev Mountain had gotten. So that was my first sense of context, was when you actually sold the company. And then I was grateful that you had went on to do your own thing. I was like, that was his thing. That's what he should have been doing. And I was like, there was a good reason that he, like, if you just went and like got a job somewhere and was programming, I would have been really pissed. Like forever, I would have been pissed. Sure. But there was something about seeing like your success in that I was very proud. I was like, I'm glad that he left. I'm glad that he did his own thing. And then I waited 3 more years until I called you.
Well, I think it's like, I honestly, and I'm not exaggerating, but like, I think about Jive every so often. No,
that was our first thing, huh?
Our first project together was this thing called Jive, which was basically like, if you look at it now, it was way ahead of its time. Like we had really, and when I say we, this was like your and Justin's kind of baby, but no, like you guys had kind of zeroed in. You had zeroed in on this dynamic of like social interactions. It was really before a lot of like social networks kind of came into their own as we understand them today. It was really before Twitter kind of like became this mainstream thing. It was definitely before Reddit became a mainstream thing. Like in an alternate universe somewhere, Jive is Reddit, in my mind at least. Like, you know, in some other part of the microverse or multiverse or whatever Marvel calls it, like Jive is like the prominent, you know, front page of the internet. Like it had so many of the dynamics that make Reddit so successful today. And I look at that now and I'm like, man, we were actually super close to being onto something like really, really big. I don't know if we realized it at the time. I think we knew it was special, but we kind of just like couldn't get it off the ground for multiple reasons. And maybe it was always destined to fail. But I think a lot about that project and how important that was for me to like experience like another startup venture that had like ups and downs and, you know, different things, have like an opportunity to architect something that was like at that time, one of the biggest things I'd ever built, like most complex things I'd ever built. It was like this, you know, forum plus all this game mechanics, gamification. It was definitely like one of the most complex things I'd ever seen, if not the most complex thing I'd ever seen up until that point. But I often reflect about Jive and I'm like, man, I wonder where, if we had made another turn or talked to the right person or gotten the right audience, it would have totally taken off, you know?
It's an interesting thought. And for context, so this is back, I believe that was in 2007, 2008-ish, when we kind of thought of that idea. We brainstormed the whole concept with you. You were into it. Like essentially what Jive was if you imagined Yahoo Answers, but we had gamified it and added kind of real world incentives. And we had an idea of it kind of being first for entertainment purposes. Like you post these questions and it's kind of like the most witty answers, the most witty responses would win. And you would have this gamified system. This is before there was gamification on most websites. This is before like most of that stuff became a thing. But yeah, we were just kind of 3 Yahoos throwing sticks at a wall and trying to figure out if anything worked. And if it had funding, like if we had the backing to actually continue with it for a couple of years, I do think we would have figured out a formula that worked. Like, I don't know that we had it at that point, but I feel like it would have been something. But yeah, man,
I mean, even just the gamification part of it, this was before anything was upvoted, right? Like we were using upvotes and downvotes and gamifying that and like having this incentive to participate and to provide the best answer that really drives most of like today's interactions with like likes or comments or Reddit, like I say, upvotes. Like that's a huge part of the way we
leveling up too, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
We had badges, we had leveling up, we had like, it was, I think if we had just white labeled it as a gamification platform, that would have been its own thing. But it's interesting though, because there's kind of that mixture of not only do you need the idea and the talent and like on board. We had the idea, we had the talent, but we didn't have the runway. You know, we didn't have the time to kind of flesh it out of like what it would be. But it was fun.
It was super fun.
I still have that project killed somewhere. Dude, there's so many killed projects.
Yep. I came across, it was like some notes in a Google Doc. I can't even remember how I found this. It was like in my Google Doc, like archives or something, but I was digging for something and I found like some Jive notes where we had some meeting and it was like all these to-dos. We need to redesign the game system. We need to roll out this new thing. It was like this list of things that I needed to do. And I was like, oh man, it just gave me another chance to like reflect on that whole project. And it was cool because, I mean, like so many things in my life, it wasn't necessarily about the financial outcome or like the success or anything like that. It was more about like the learning and the people, right? And I remember like when we got connected, which I think was through kind of a mutual friend that kind of introduced me as a programmer and you guys as kind of these, the business guys. And we got connected. I remember feeling like, oh, these guys, like I felt the same thing about you guys where I was like, these guys are going somewhere. Like this is going to be whatever they do, they're going to be super successful at it. And like, I even told my wife, I've told my wife that many times throughout the years, is like, if they choose to be a photography studio, they're going to be like the best photography studio out there. If they want to be like whatever, they're going to make it happen because these guys are just super talented.
Well, thanks, man. Well, it's been a wild ride across the board. And likewise, like that's kind of the same feeling that we had with you. I think the original person that introduced us, wasn't it the, I forgot his name, but he did the artwork for Jive, wasn't it? He was a designer.
Okay, I don't remember that part, but I think he designed some games. Was it Clark?
Yes. Clark
Stacy?
Oh, no. Clark was a different. Did Clark introduce us? So Clark is Justin's uncle.
Yeah, because we had worked, Clark and I had worked on this project together for like this, because and I think he still does, like works on like kids games and educational games and things.
Yes. Okay.
And then he was like, hey, I have these guys that are looking for a developer that writes PHP. And, can you jump in and help them out? And I was like, sure. And I think I just started a small consulting firm at the time. And I was like, sure, we'll take this on as like a client. And then it became a lot more than that. So, yeah.
That's crazy. Sorry, Clark's not Justin's uncle, brother-in-law.
Oh, okay.
So do you know that Clark's company now, WildWorks, I actually just brought him on the podcast recently too. WildWorks has a piece of game IP called Animal Jam. It has over 100 million players.
So if I'm not mistaken, and I may be totally wrong here, but I'm pretty sure I worked on early versions of Animal Jam. Like I think that was one of the things that I helped him out way early. I may be way off, and you might be like, no, I'm sure it was. Jam. But like in my mind, that was what I worked on. But yeah,
I think it was because the time is.
Yeah, very distantly, I've kind of noticed that being super successful, and I'm just like, oh, that's awesome, good for them.
Yeah. So now they developed a new game that is basically, and I was talking to him, I'm like, what is the purpose of the new game? He's like, well, essentially everybody coming out of Animal Jam is now 25 years old and they don't want to play this game anymore. So they designing like a new platform for basically the people that come out of Animal Jam. So the timing is, I'll guarantee that's exactly what you were working on was Animal Jam. And now they have, I think it was Roar. What was it called? Do you remember the name of it, Anthony?
I actually don't remember.
Okay. Anthony's, do you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast at all?
I've listened to like one full episode and then clips of like 100 different episodes.
Okay. So Joe has Jamie. We have Anthony. Anthony is our Jamie.
Awesome.
He's the voice of God that chimes in, that will look up whatever we want to look up, show anything. But that's crazy, dude. And what always blew me away with you was that you were self-taught in programming. That doesn't compute for me.
So I actually don't think it's that weird nowadays. I mean, back then I think it was not like normal to have somebody who kind of came into web development or software engineering as a self-taught, because we just all assumed back then that was how you learned anything, is you had to go get like a degree in that thing in college. But I mean, look at you guys. I mean, you didn't get your degree in photography, and yet like you're this like world-class photographer, right? So I don't see it as all
That's
that
only because
different
you
than a
don't
lot of
know.
people.
You don't know world-class photos, so you just assume.
That's true. Well, I would, touche. I would also say that you probably don't know world-class engineering. So
For sure.
I am definitely not the best programmer or engineer in the world.
But I do know this. So I did a lot of programming when I was younger, and that was one of my that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a video game developer. I got so far to Acclaim Entertainment, where I came in as a game tester and Q&A person. And as I was studying programming in school, I was practicing with like debug and the code side of things. And I got to this place pretty quickly where I realized that, like, I had a friend who was becoming a coder at the time. He was learning, and when we would sit down together, it was funny because I started out knowing more than he did, but very quickly he was able to kind of intuitively understand and know like libraries and the, passing of variables between like completely different libraries and the usage of like all these different things that I had such a difficult time wrapping my head around. And I needed somebody to explain like the why behind every single thing to be able to internalize something. And that wasn't available at the time. At the time, like you really either were studying at a university or you were just figuring out on your own. And I had the hardest time figuring it out on my own. So I don't think it's easy. I don't think that's
it wasn't easy. And I used to tell the Dev Mountain students this all the time. So Stack Overflow, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with Stack Overflow. It's like basically the programmer's Google, like any question from any language, even like bugs, like specific, like, error codes. Sometimes you can search those in Stack Overflow and find the exact answers.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? It's all gamified, right? So like the best answers are at the top. You get rewards for providing the best answers, like Deja Vu, right?
Got that from?
Yeah, seriously, they stole it from us. But Stack Overflow didn't exist when I was learning all this stuff. And it is an amazing resource. And there are dozens of other resources like Stack Overflow out there now. Back when I was learning, it was forums. And so like I was like trolling these forums where people would post, hey, I'm having this problem. And it was like those terrible forums where you have to go through like pages and pages and pages of responses and hope that like the person who had the error eventually came back to tell everyone what they did to fix it, because otherwise you were just like scrolling and clicking for no reason. And it was challenging. And I tell my students, like, it took me at least a year and a half to become like any level of competent, web developer. Whereas like nowadays, the tools that are at our hands, you can learn so much faster than that.
It's so different. When you created Dev Mountain, I was thinking, if this existed when I was learning, my career path would have very likely been different. I would have actually stuck to this because I could have gotten into a pathway that I understood. And Dev Mountain is almost, at least from what I understand, let me give context for this. So when you left the project that we were working on, and I'm going to keep saying that just to make you feel bad about it. When you rightfully left, you created Dev Mountain, which was a Utah-based development company. Yeah, Anthony, why don't you pull that up, actually? A Utah-based educational school that helps developers to learn. Why don't you explain exactly what it is? Because it'll sound 10 times better coming from you.
Yeah, and I'll explain it kind of from the genesis of it. At the time, I was in the process of moving back from the Bay Area to Utah, where I had lived previously. And the startup that I was working with at the time was based in Utah. And they were like, hey, we'll pay for you to move back here. And I was like, sure, why not? Mm-hmm. Avoid super high rents in San Francisco. Like, that sounds great.
That's brutal.
Yeah. And that was back in like 2012. So in that process of moving back, I'd heard of these like dev boot camps there was a couple of them that had popped up. I think one in Chicago. I think there was one on the East Coast, but it was like a brand new concept. And it was like, in hindsight, it made complete sense. Like, instead of putting somebody through a 4-year program with all these generals and all these classes, like, let's just give them a super highly focused regimen of content and curriculum and training in like 12 weeks. And turns out you can learn a lot in 12 weeks. And I'm like, that is amazing. And I wish that this existed when I was learning. And so I'm like, I I feel like this is something Utah could really use. I mean, I know the area well enough here, and I knew the business and the need for developers enough here where I'm like, man, I really think this could be something that would be useful. And I started by teaching people from the assumption that I could do it in a part-time format. So I was still working, full-time job at the startup. And so I would, have my day job, and then I would go teach these classes at night to people who would also be coming from work or from school, to sit in class for 3 hours a night, multiple nights a week, and then Saturdays as well. So we were like trying to take.
Bless your wife for supporting you during this time.
Man.
Oh my goodness.
It was a rough time. And I very quickly recruited other instructors to come in, because I knew I just would not be able to sustain that pace of, working crazy hours and weekends and that kind of thing. But so yeah, it turns out when you get a bunch of people who are super motivated, and this is part of the equation, right? Is like, so I taught some programming classes at a local university here for a while. And inevitably in every single college class, and you'll remember this from your experience, right? You've got a group of people in the room that just do not care, and they don't want to be there. And they're just going to whatever, blow everything off. You've got some people on the other end of the spectrum that are super into it. And no matter how fast you go, you're not going fast enough for those people.
Yep.
And then you have this wide middle that just kind of want to get a good grade. And I don't really know if I'm going to do this, but I just want to get a good grade. Right. And I'm like, if you just took those people on the other side that are super motivated, driven, passionate, and you put all of those people in a classroom, how fast could you go? Right. That was kind of my initial thesis. And so that's what I did. I interviewed every student that was coming into those first classes to kind of get a feel for, do they have any background or experience in this? How motivated and passionate are they about learning this? Because it wasn't just about getting a job. If all it was hey, I want to make more money, it's that's not good enough. You've got to really want to do this, because nights and weekends doing this, if you don't have passion and motivation beyond a salary, it's probably not going to carry you through that difficult learning curve. And so, get all those people in a room. I think we had 17 in the first cohort or something like that. And it was just, first of all, it was crazy amounts of fun, because when you have this lab of people, and the curriculum was terrible. The first cohort, I was making things up. Every day I was writing the lesson plan for that night, and then I was rewriting it afterwards, because it was well, that didn't work, And so we were super exploratory, trying.
Were you charging for this first cohort?
Yes.
Yeah, this was still a charge experience. Okay.
I charged for it, which is kind of unbelievable. And one of the unbelievable parts of it was, one of the guys in the class came to me, gosh, it had to have been 3 or 4 weeks before the class ended. And he was like, man, I'm in a tough place. He had a job at the time, and he's like, I just got laid off from my job. And I don't know, should I go get another job, or should I stick this out? Should I drop out and get a job and just focus on that? Or should I stick this out and just see what happens? Question. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to answer this, because either way, I could be giving you the wrong answer that could literally change your life. He decided to stick with it, and ended up getting a job in the tech industry after this. And I so that amazing moment, I think for me, sealed the deal, because I was like, this isn't just fun, lab, let's all learn together. This is really impacting people's lives in a very meaningful way. And he was the number one, the first, and one of the loudest advocates that we had was this changed my life. You should do this type of person. And so I think that really convinced me that not only was this fun and exciting and valuable, but it was life-changing. And so if the business model essentially became, if we can take people's money and give them a reasonable expectation that we can change their lives, then game on, let's do this thing. Right. And so after I think we had 2 cohorts, and after that I was okay, I got to do this full time. I can't do nights and weekends anymore. I've got to put everything I have into this. That's the only way this is going to succeed, is if I'm able to give it everything I have. And so that kind of started the crazy ride. But yeah, the basic tenet of it is, if you're not distracted, or if you don't have other classes you're trying to stack at the same time, if you're focused on one thing and one thing only, and you're put in an environment where learning is the design of the learning leads to experiential learning. And that's a critical part of this, right? Because you go, you remember a lot of university classes, and it's sitting in a dark room watching the professor on a projector, right? Or showing PowerPoint slides. I mean, come on, we live in the information age. You can find any of that stuff on the internet. You don't need to sit in the classroom and have a professor walk you through slides to be able to learn stuff like that. So really, it was more about how can we get their fingers on the keyboard as much as possible throughout class, get them the hands-on learning that they need. And if we can do that like day in and day out, over time, they're going to gain those skills way faster than they would by sitting in a bunch of classes. And like, we definitely had a lot to learn and got better and better at it. But like, I think the basic premise there like turned out to be true. Like you could really learn how to be a computer, a web developer or whatever in 12 weeks.
Well, there's so many brilliant pieces of what you just said in there, which I'm going to dive into. But to close out this storyline, 4 to 5 years later, that's when you sold Dev. Can you tell us about selling Dev Mountain at that point?
Yeah. So we basically grew. I mean, like we had no idea what we were doing. But it was an all cash business. So we never like took on any funding, and there's pros and cons to that we can absolutely dive into, but we decided to make it a completely bootstrapped business. The benefit that we had was that students all paid tuition on the first day. So we basically had working capital that we could use for that entire cohort and beyond to invest in growth or to invest in other things that we needed. And so we basically expanded as aggressively as we could without taking on outside capital. So we had 2 locations in Utah. We had a location in Phoenix, Arizona, and we had a location in Dallas, Texas. So we were kind of growing to become this sort of Intermountain / Midwest, network of coding boot camps. And we also had expanded our curriculum beyond just web development to include like iOS development. So, programming like iPhone apps, as well as UX design. So we'd added kind of a design flavor, a design track to it as well.
And that was did you have partners in this?
Yeah. So okay. I brought on 2 partners after the first cohort because I just knew that like I needed to focus on basically the curriculum, the experience, like making sure the product itself was really, really solid. And they were primarily like logistics, operations, and marketing. Like I didn't have time to like, build design and make app or make ads or anything like that. And so they did all of that and did a fantastic job. And so they came on as partners. And so the 3 of us kind of called ourselves, we were all co-founders of Dev Mountain. And so, so we kind of reached this point where we didn't really know where to go next. We had expanded to some different geographical areas. We were feeling the growing pains of expansion in the sense of, well, if we're going to continue to expand like this, we're either going to have to bring in outside capital because it's just like too resource constrained to like make, to draw all of our cash down to almost zero every time we're going to go into a new market. Or we need to partner with somebody who's just like has similar ideas as us. And just so happened at that time when we were starting to ask these questions, we had a group reach out to us that felt really aligned. We'd had a few reach out to us kind of like fishing for information or, sometimes, sometimes you'll have people like reach out like, oh, so-and-so is interested in buying you. And really they're not, they're just kind of like wanting to steal strategy or learn more about or gather data or whatever. But one group reached out and we really liked them. And the more we talked to them, the more we were like, oh, this could be a really great kind of next chapter for the business. Turned out they were an online university that was really interested in kind of expanding their non-degree offerings. And just culturally, they fit a lot with the way we viewed the world, how we viewed learners, kind of learner-centric experiences. And so, they made us an offer and we felt like it was the right step. So
give me the number, bro. What was the number? I remember the number.
So it was, it's all public knowledge, but it was like, the basic terms of the contract was like 15 million with like an earn out portion on top of that if we met certain targets and, whatever time periods. So, yeah.
Dude, I love that.
I mean, it's funny because like 15 million, this kind of gets into like startup financing and everything, but 15 million doesn't sound like a lot to, when you hear about these huge exits and like companies selling to other companies for hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. And I totally get that. Like this was not a blockbuster, like, New York Times front page type of acquisition. For us, it was really, really meaningful for 2 reasons. One is it was completely bootstrapped. So we didn't have to pay back investors and then see the return and the fruits of our labors. The second reason was because we really felt like this was the next step to grow the business. Like we felt like with their resources, with their network, with their know-how, we knew we could get Dev Mountain into, much more places and maybe expand the reach a lot more than we could. So it was exciting.
Sounds like you still have stake in the business, but they maybe have majority ownership. Is that kind of how it is now, or?
No, so I completely sold all of it. So there was there was no like stock exchange. Yeah, it was all cash.
Okay, that's crazy, dude. I mean, I feel like too often media, newspapers, like puts too much focus on those $100 million, $500 million sales. Those are lottery tickets, man. I mean, the chances of getting to that place, like, honestly, I wish all of the, more, I don't even want to say common successes, because your success is not common, but more of your successes and these types of successes were actually published and talked about, because it's fantastic. It's far more relatable than selling off Instagram. And I'll give you an example of this. I have a friend, Chase Jarvis, who developed the first Instagram. It wasn't called Instagram. He made the legit, like, it was an app that was, and I forgot what it was called, but it was the precursor to Instagram. Instagram came, basically used the idea, said this is going to be a big thing, maybe made some tweaks, did a little bit better, marketed it, and it became Instagram. So Chase is sitting on this thing that essentially was Instagram that never became it. Why? Because they just got the word out quicker. And I think that is, when you're talking about the lottery tickets, that's usually the 99% outcome of every single one of those businesses, is they build it up and there's nothing to come from it. Where if we made the model of success creating something of value, hoping that maybe one day you can exit, I think in general, everything would be better in society, would it not? Like, if people weren't trying to like punch their lottery ticket with every single business they created, then what you would have overall is just a substantial amount of better businesses that are designed to give, and create value. 100%. But instead,
everybody's swinging for the fences, right? Everybody's like trying to hit the home run, the 100 million, the $1 billion idea. I agree with you. And I think Dev Mountain actually proved that to me, because I would even say that like our level of success is there's probably a lot more stories like that out there that, like you said, just don't ever get mentioned. The other stories that don't ever get mentioned are the people who don't sell and are able to create just a really great revenue generating business. And just like, they build a really solid business and live off of that for the rest of their lives, more than they even need. They're just generating cash, and they're investing in new projects, or they're investing it in their own, lifestyle or whatever. And there are so many of those businesses out there that just, for whatever reason, don't fit kind of the tech startup narrative and aren't sexy enough to talk about, but like, yet financially they are wildly successful. I remember thinking about this, where I met some of these folks where I'm like, wow, you're doing extremely well. And yet no one would ever think to like write about this in a tech blog or put it on a podcast necessarily. Like, and sometimes I would even think, had we not had that outcome, let's say we had gone through all of that and ended up, the other thing that you don't hear about is sometimes acquisitions end up being a really bad deal, right?
For sure.
Like sometimes you sell away your business for a majority of stock in another company that ends up failing. They shut down your business and basically you walk away with nothing, right?
Yeah.
And even though the news articles made it seem like you're this big success, you're actually like worse off financially than maybe you were when you started. And so, these businesses out there that are just like doing really well, generating tons of revenue, for whatever reason, they're not sexy enough to talk about, but they are absolutely amazing businesses. And I remember thinking like that could have been a path that we took. Like we absolutely could have done that. And, we felt right about what we did, but there are many paths to success and definitions of success that I think should be considered.
I also feel like you and your partners could have continued to build Dev Mountain to be whatever it is that you wanted to be. I think there's something to be said about exiting when you want to exit. Like, sometimes we create something and we don't want it to be the next 40 years of our life. We just want to create something and then maybe move on to something else, so that is an important piece too, is like realizing that, like, you don't have to be the one that turns it into this, crazy thing, but it can live on and it can become that $100 million educational monster. The other piece of, this is an interesting note. Did you kind of connect the dots here that both of us did almost the exact same thing in two different fields?
Yeah.
So we did it for photography, for that, and ours was primarily focused online, and you did it this in-person experience. I very much wanted to do the in-person version. And what I realized was that there's not enough demand for wedding photographers or portrait photographers in any specific area to fill up a classroom repeatedly over and over. So we were like, the only option for us is really an online platform and educational system. But when I saw you do that in person, I was like, oh, I so wish our field was one, because programming and coding is a field where there's a lot of demand, and it's going to be ongoing demand indefinitely for this job. You also picked a brilliant time to do it in Utah, because that was kind of when Utah was kind of booming as the next Silicon Valley. So that was great timing as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can't take credit for any of that. And frankly, that's part of, every narrative, almost every narrative of startup success has some elements or some milestones of like the right person at the right time, talking to the right, the right client, the right venture capitalist, investor or whatever. And I felt really lucky that I just happened to be moving back to Utah at that time when it was like just ready to pop.
Yeah, I mean, people say that there's that element of like luck and timing and stuff like that. And I do agree, maybe there's some of it. But at the same time, I think a huge piece of that luck was self-manufactured. I mean, you knew the environment, you knew people were coming up and that they were needing the education. You were there to witness it. So it seemed kind of natural for you to create that. And I think you would have done it wherever you lived and would have been successful at it.
Yeah, I think so. The way I describe the luck portion of this is like, I have no idea how the actual story worked. Somebody who knows history better could explain it to me, but I imagine Benjamin Franklin, like out there with his like kite and his like key or whatever, like doing the lightning experiment, the electricity experiment. And I think about that in terms of startups sometimes, where it's like, if you spend all day in your room just reading about other startups and like trying to plan the perfect entrance into this market and the perfect, like lucky, you can't plan that. But what you can do is put yourself in a position to discover those opportunities as often as possible, sort of like fishing, right? Like the longer you spend in the water in the right spots, the more likely you are to find and catch the right fish. And I run into entrepreneurs like this sometimes who just can't seem to commit and jump into it and really put themselves in the river. It's like they want somebody to tell them when the exact moment is, that it's like the lowest risk, the highest opportunity. They want to make sure the idea is perfect. They want to make sure everything's figured out before they jump in. And it's like, just get in the water. Like you're going to figure it out. And those chances are going to come to you. And maybe you're not fully ready, but like being in the water is going to give you a much greater chance of success than just kind of like, biding your time and looking for the perfect opportunity.
I think that is one of the biggest struggles that entrepreneurs have, especially on the kind of perfecting the product side. Entrepreneurs in general are creatively minded, and they want this thing to be the end all be all solution to everything. And I know I've fallen into this myself many times in creating different products, as you want it to be perfect. What I love about your story, this beginning piece of it, and that's why I asked if you were charging, was because I wanted to go back to that and say, you have to do exactly what you said. You have to jump in. I mean, it's akin to like, to go along with your fishing analogy. It's like you're going fishing. You don't have waders. You don't have boots. You're in your shorts. You don't even have a proper pole. Maybe you're using a stick, and you have a string that's tied to some sort of, bait, but you have this idea that there's fish there. So let's just see if there are, and let's work on the rest as it happens. And that's kind of exactly what you did. You charged and to you, you're like, I didn't even have a curriculum. I don't even know how that worked, but I'll guarantee that if it's something you want to do, and I know your intelligence, I know that despite not having a curriculum, even the first cohort got more than their fair share of value, even though it wasn't the ideal product that you would present. Would you not agree?
Sure. Oh yeah, 100%. And I think that, this is kind of classic, like lean startup methodology, right? Is, if you take all the time and money to buy the waders and the super expensive gear, and then only to find out that you like camped in the wrong spot and there's actually no fish in that river at all. It's like, okay, that kind of failure is way worse than just like trying different spots and having your shorts on. And then as you realize like, oh, there's a huge amount of fish. And I don't want to take this too far, this analogy, but that's part of it.
Take it far, dude. Let's talk about the specific fish you're catching.
Then once you know the species, no, I'm just kidding. It's like, yeah, it's like you just have to start somewhere. And this is probably the most common piece of advice I give to entrepreneurs, which first of all, it's ironic to me that like people, this is another one of those kind of like mythos kind of things where it's like, when somebody has an exit and or like has this multi-million dollar exit, suddenly it's like they have all the answers. It's like, we should go ask this person because they sold a company, right? And yeah, I've learned things, I've experienced things, but I also know a ton of other entrepreneurs who are really, really smart and bright and have great ideas who don't ever get asked for advice because they haven't had like a headline exit or something like that. So anyway, that aside, as people, would come and talk to me about their ideas and like, should I do this? And they're looking for validation, they're looking for confidence as they get going. My advice, like 99% of the time, is like, just do it. Like, I don't care if I think your idea is the stupidest idea ever. You're going to learn more by jumping in and trying to do this and failing than you ever would by talking to 50 different people and getting their opinions on your ideas. In fact, most ideas sound like really terrible ideas when they start out. Sure. Like, most people would be like, why would you ever stay in somebody's house in another city? That sounds terrible. Why would I ever like jump in somebody else's car to take me to the airport? That seems weird and creepy. Yeah. And so most of those ideas sound like terrible ideas at the start. And so we oftentimes look for validation in the wrong places. But yeah, it's like, just get started, like try it, get your first version out there and then learn from that. You're going to start learning the right things much faster than just, spinning around in your room or in your office or something.
Nike figured that out 50 years ago, man. Just do it. Just go.
Just do it. That's so true. Wisdom.
No, I agree. And I feel like entrepreneurs often get in their own way, almost more often than, I would say that there's actually obstacles in front of them. There's always some sort of a reason or excuse as to why. I had a friend in college who I'm going to talk about a venture. One of my very first successful businesses was completely illegal. It was George Lucas refused to take the original Star Wars and put it on a DVD. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a massive uproar in the entire Star Wars community of like, why won't you give us the original Star Wars? And basically he said, the original Star Wars does not exist anymore. What exists is my CGI version of the Star Wars, trilogy. And that's what you guys are getting. Well, there's such an uproar in these like hardcore fanatic communities that like, basically it became a market to see who can come up with like the best Laserdisc to DVD transposals of the original trilogy. So my friend and I, we did what Nike does, and we just did it. we made the best transposal. It was so good, and the quality was like awesome. Like we did like laser and etched like artwork onto the CDs. Like it looked legit. And I think we'd probably sold like $20,000 of these. Like the people were buying them for like $150 for a set of these DVDs because you can't get them anywhere else. Eventually, like all great stories, we were reported to the MPAA, and they came to us with a cease and desist, and we said, "Yep, no problem. We just want to say that George Lucas caused this, and if he fulfilled that need, then we wouldn't have had a need to."
Did you have to pay them the money back, or
no? They just said cease and desist, and they were done with it. They I don't think they knew that we'd made 20,000 something dollars in revenue. Maybe well, they would have done something, but even then, it's like a drop in the bucket compared to whatever. But anyway, I don't really know why I went down this road, other than just to say you have to like kind of just jump in and do something that's not illegal. But the funny part was, when we kind of like left, see, I was kind of the person that's sort of impetuous and like, look, let's just go and like get something done. And when we kind of left that relation, well, I'm still friends with him, but for the next decade, he kind of just kept thinking of good ideas, but kept perfecting those ideas and never actually executed on them. And I don't really know what to say to that other than what you already said, which is just, it's okay that it's not perfect. Go and like test the waters.
Yeah. Well, and I think this comes to like, why, like, what is the hesitation? Like, what is the motive for holding back or not jumping in? And most of the time it's fear, right? Like in his case, it might've been fear of doing something else wrong and being slapped in the face. But I think most of us have just an innate and learned fear of failure, right? It's like, if I fail, if my business fails, if my idea fails, if my product fails, that means something about me. That means that I don't know, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not good enough, or whatever, which is, it's like this core human thing that's really, really hard to root out of yourself. But as an entrepreneur, I mean, this I think every good entrepreneur knows this, but like, fear of failure is one of the worst possible things that you can have be a part of you, because you ultimately will never take any real risks. You'll never really be able to find out the right product. I think so many people are kind of obsessed with the perfect idea, right? Like I'm sure you've had this happen. People be like, I want to take you to lunch. I want to tell you about my idea. And I'm like, oh boy, here we go. Yeah. So they take you to lunch and they're like, let me tell you my idea. And they've got all these sketches.
You don't say yes to those anymore, do you? Do you still say yes to that?
What I tell them is do it, like build the idea, because guess what? Whatever you have here, this idea that you have is probably not it. Like this is not the idea. What you have is a direction and a start, but do that and then see if that actually works, because most likely it's a derivative of this idea that you have that might or might not work. But you've got to get to that derivative as soon as possible and stop sitting in your bedroom, like dreaming up the how you're going to scale it to international, the community and make billions of dollars. Like they're already thinking about like level 10 when really they haven't even got off the launch pad yet. And that's something that's just really hard to break out of. And there's some funny stories around this, but like one way I see this, this fear of failure and kind of this fear dynamic in entrepreneurship is people will be like, hey, I have this idea, but I need you to sign an NDA. And I'm kind of like, ooh, unless you are a NASA a scientist with an algorithm that helps us time travel, or unless you are some crazy like quantum physicist, most likely your idea is not even original. Somebody else has already thought of your idea. And there's actually a decent chance that either I've thought of it or somebody I know has thought of it. So I will never sign an NDA, because I might just be like putting myself in legal trouble, because then you're going to say, oh, well, he saw my idea and then whatever. And it just proves kind of this mindset of like, it's not the idea that matters. It's not the idea. Anybody can come up with an idea, and actually really good ideas, but it's the execution, it's the implementation, it's the iteration on that idea that really, really that drives the value. I had this one guy one time, and he was a good friend, but it was this weird ending to a relationship. He had told me about this idea, and it was actually a really good idea. I was like, wow, that's smart. And Airbnb actually does the exact idea that he's doing now. But at the time it was like, wow, that's kind of a cool idea. And then fast forward like 3 years later, and I think I was just getting started with Dev Mountain, and I can't remember the exact context, but he was like, hey, I want to take you to lunch and kind of catch you up with stuff. And I'm like, okay, cool. So we go to lunch, and he's kind of like asking me these really questions, like about what I'm up to and like how I got about doing it and all these different things. And at one point I was just like, what is it that you want to talk about? And he's like, I just need to ask you a question. He's like, are you stealing my idea? What? And I was like, dude, I haven't even thought about your idea in 3 years. Like he was in this like crazy place of like paranoia of somebody's going to steal my idea and build it before I have a chance to. And I think one of the things you learn as an entrepreneur is, first of all, if there are like-minded individuals that believe in this crazy thing that you're building, you need to become friends with them as soon as possible, because you're going to need all the help you can get, right, to build the thing that you're trying to build. And secondly, like if you can't execute on your idea and somebody else is able to, then you probably had no business doing it in the first place, right? And that comes back to the first thing of like, even in that and failing in that, you're going to learn way more than just like being paranoid and have everybody sign NDAs and being scared that everyone's stealing your idea. It was an interesting kind of comical experience.
Well, Anthony, there's about a bajillion sound bites and snippets right in that piece that Kaylin just dropped right there. That was like,
it's all noted down.
Pure knowledge bomb. No, I agree with you 100%, 1000%. And I get like every time somebody comes to me and first my eyes are already rolling when it's like, I've got this business idea. Now, if you say, okay, I've got this new like business, will you come to my home? Then like my eyes are rolling 10 times over because I know it's a multi-level marketing thing. But
if they've got a whiteboard set up in the room, you're in for a treat.
If there's other people there and like there's refreshments, like this is a problem. But there's as soon as somebody says, I got this idea, I'm already rolling my eyes. Now, when you say NDA, I've checked out. I'm done.
Yep.
Like if you say NDA, I'm done. Because that proves to me that you think the idea is actually valuable. And like you can actually go Google business ideas and come up with like there's websites that just have thousands of lists of just business ideas, like right there. You gotta go pick one, go do something. But there's a weird psychological piece that is it's not only in entrepreneurship, it's also like in the creative world. Like I get asked this a lot by our online students who will say like, Pi, why do you put this education out there? I mean, aren't you worried that you're creating your own competitors? Or like, Pi, why do you hire people and teach them everything you know? Aren't you worried that they're going to leave and like steal your business? And my response is, look, dude, because it's always the guys who ask this question. It's not the girls. They never ask these questions. They're much smarter than this. But I'm always like, look, dude, if someone is going to leave Linen Jersa and go and recreate it, then they probably would have done that on their own anyway. Like They didn't need us to get there. Okay. Second, if you think like running Linen Jersa is just about taking good pictures, you are like 99% off as to like what we actually do. So most of the people that attempt something like that would never even get there. And then the same thing with like online education. They're like, why would you create this? Aren't you worried that people are going to copy your workshops and go do it? Like go like the what you said about the execution piece is the side that's always going to be missing. And if they were going to be successful with it, they would have done it anyway. And my argument too is if they are going to do it anyway, you might as well be part of the process and create a relationship there so that you can lift each other up along the way.
Right.
But it's this them or us mentality. Maybe it goes back to like tribalism. Maybe it goes back to whatever it is, but it's a very odd mentality that goes across every category of life.
Well, there's this falsehood that so many of us believe as first time or early entrepreneurs, which is competition is going to be my biggest threat. Like competition. And yes, competition does become a threat, but only after you've reached like a level of success that actually attracts competition. Most people are not interested in competing with business ideas that suck or with businesses that haven't gone off the ground yet. So once you've achieved the level of success where you're actually attracting competition, that's when you know you're actually doing really, really well. And people just flip those. They think like, oh, well, if I can eliminate competition, I'll be fine. And it's like, no, you actually need to be successful enough that you are attracting competition. And I think, Paul Graham and some of the Silicon Valley startup folks talk a lot about this, where it's like, stop obsessing about competition and worry about the real problem, which is getting people to use your stinking product, right? Like that's the real problem. If you can get people to care enough about what you're doing to use it and to compete with it, it's like you're on the right track.
For sure, dude. So one of the things that you mentioned was this educational gap. And I want to go back to that because that's been one of my honest frustrations for a very long time, is kind of the way that our educational system is designed. It's also part of kind of the motivation for, it really has to do with everything with how I teach personally, because growing up, I was led to believe until I was 19 years old. And I don't know if you know this now, but I'm not practicing anymore. But when I was 19, I went and served a LDS mission. And it wasn't until that point that I kind of realized that, hey, I actually can learn things and I actually can do stuff. Because up until then, the educational system was designed in such a way that I just thought I was stupid. And everybody around me played into it. Like, oh, you're not very smart because I don't like taking tests and I don't like learning stupid things. So when I would ask teachers like, why do I need to know this? They would say, you just do. And I wouldn't be motivated to learn it. I wouldn't practice it. I wouldn't learn it. I wouldn't whatever. And it wasn't until after the mission when I was like, you know what, if I ask why and I actually learn that first, I can study. And then I went back to university and I just made sure I always understood why I was doing a particular thing. And then I had almost a 4.0 GPA through all of college. And it was this weird light bulb of like, how is nobody like connecting the dots? Not only teaching the why of like what we're doing, but how are the most important lessons just completely removed from education?
Yeah. Oh man, I could talk for hours about this.
Please, we have hours.
This is such an important topic, and it's actually a big part of the venture that I'm involved with right now, which is focused on kids education. So Plutarch had this saying, this like classical saying, which is education is not filling a vessel, it's lighting a flame, right? Mm-hmm. And somehow in modern education, we've completely got that backwards, right? We have this teacher at the front of the room whose job it is to transmit knowledge compulsory to every single student in the classroom. And the student's job is to sit in their seat, shut up, and just receive, right? Like, okay, let education happen to me. Like I will go to school and education will happen to me. Turns out there's like some fundamental like universe like shaking flaws in that assumption, which is if I don't choose to learn as a student, it doesn't matter what you tell me, I'm not going to learn it, right? Like agency is this critical piece to the learning education, to the learning equation that we've just kind of ignored for a long time. It's like, well, if we put bells in classrooms, maybe we can train kids kind of like Pavlov's dogs to just like jump up when they need to and run around and then come back in and sit down and be quiet and listen. And if we like discipline them, we can turn them into really good troops or really good industrial workers that are really good instruction followers or whatever. And that's really kind of all of our education system. And if you look at education history, this is literally where it came from, right?
Yep.
We have, people looking at like the Prussians to say like, oh, how are they creating such well-behaved citizens that are like joining the military? Well, let's take that system and let's put it in our schools here. And guess what? Like our schools haven't really changed much in the last 150 to 200 years. Like they're pretty much the same thing. You look around and people have said this, and I can't remember who to attribute this to, but they said if you were to take somebody, from the 1800s or the early 1900s and transport them to the future, one of the only things they would recognize would be like the public school system, right? And they would be like, oh yeah, I know what this is because I've been there before. Now, I'm not one of these people that just thinks like, like tech is everything and everything needs to be reinvented in the image of tech or anything like that. I think there are principles that are tried and true. There are things worth saving and there's room for like preserving the wisdom of the past. But the method
sloppy joes, man, sloppy joes are worth saving.
Oh yeah. Never. You can never get rid of sloppy joes. But in the classroom, there's just some fundamental flaws that we just never thought to like challenge, right? And
well,
nowadays,
if you do challenge it, you're dumb. If you do challenge it, if you say this isn't how I learn, then you're labeled as stupid, like you don't get it.
Yeah. Well, think about how many times in your, especially early education, how many times were you encouraged to like ask questions? Very, very few.
Rarely.
Like,
yeah.
In fact, if you ask a question, typically the teacher in the room perceives that as like a threat or a challenge. And there are really good teachers out there. Don't get me wrong, like really great people. But the system is built to where you can't. You got 30 kids in the room. If all of them ask questions, you're not going to get through any of the content. And guess what? I've got to get through all this content because it's coming up on the test in a couple of months or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there's so many things going against these great human beings that are teachers in the public school system, where it's like they've got to teach to a test. If the kids don't do well on the test, they look bad. Everything happens. It's funny because one of the ways that I think about this is if you just say some really fundamental, easy, like simple statements that make sense to everybody, but yet if you put them in the context of like education, they seem revolutionary. It's like there's a problem there, right? Like if you ask the question, what if learning could be fun? And everybody's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, like mind blown. Like I didn't realize learning could be fun. It's like, how did we not ever think learning could be fun? Because guess what? When you're a kindergartner or you're like a little kid, learning is absolutely what you're built to do. Every single human being comes pre-programmed to like optimize for learning. But instead of like using the natural gifts that kids have and developing their agency and their interests and keeping them motivated, we actually snuff that out very early on. And we're like, no, what you want to do doesn't matter. What we need to do is what I want to do. And so you're going to sit down and listen to me. And if you resist this, you're going to be labeled as a deviant, as a problem, a troublemaker or whatever. And I mean, there's so much you could go into here. The fear of failure is everywhere in education, right? I do poorly on a test. That must mean that I'm stupid. That must mean that I'm not good at math. It could mean 100 different things other than those things, but yet that's kind of what we take. And guess what? Just like in entrepreneurship, failure is absolutely a part of learning. Like if you don't fail at the thing, then you're not actually learning the thing, right? And we've just lost that, or maybe we never had it in the first place. I think one of the reasons why this is so contrasted today, one of the reasons why it's such a problem, is because we live in a day and age where we don't need any more industrial rule followers, instruction followers. We need people that are creative. We need people that are problem solvers. We need people that can take multiple different points of view and synthesize them. We need good teachers. We need good inventors. We need good designers, creatives. That's the world we live in nowadays. And frankly, the education system, for the most part, isn't producing those kinds of people. We make kids believe that the world is an escalator, where if you just get on and sit down and kind of just bide your time at the top of the escalator, somebody's going to give you a certificate and say, here's your job, here's the rest of your life, everything's great. And what they're being faced with is they get to the top of the escalator and they realize that the rest of the world is a climbing wall, and they have no idea how to navigate it. And so it's like, oh crap, now I have to retrain myself. And you talked about this experience for you. I had the same experience where it was like, I don't know if I really knew how to learn anything until I started teaching myself programming. And then it was like, oh, I really can learn stuff. I don't have to depend on an adult to tell me what I need to learn or how I need to learn. I can actually do this on my own, and it's actually way more effective. And so if we start teaching kids at the very beginning that life is a climbing wall and not an escalator, they're going to be way more prepared for life, outside of high school or outside of college or whatever. So anyway, I'll stop there. I could go on for hours.
No, I love this topic. It's one that I talked about with Clark actually quite a bit too, because his realm of video games is actually designed to be educational. But one of these massive pieces, in terms of like the way that we're bringing, the way that we're brought up in the educational system is, like you said, conformity. Like we are taught essentially conformity. And if you are an outlier, then you're labeled as something, which, by the way, that's a problem in and of itself, because as I'm teaching my kids and I'm teaching them how I like to learn and how, what I think is the right way to learn, I'm also battling that conformity, because when they go to school, then it's two different styles and two different approaches. At home, they're getting one thing, they're getting another. But my other major issue, you can be force fed something and it could be good for you. Like that's another thing. Is like, yes, agency is a huge piece of this. And if you get to the why and you give people a good reason, then they can be they can just be intrinsically motivated to do this. But the other thing is, like, if you're feeding them garbage, then it doesn't really matter either way. And the moment that this dawned on me was actually in the process when I got the idea so this podcast is called Think Stupid Simple, right? It comes from my first book is called Stupid Simple Relationships. And it's a book that I'm going to release a little bit later this year. And I started the research for this book over 10 years ago. I started sitting down to write it about 3 years ago. And one of the very first things that I say is, despite all of my, elementary, junior high, high school education, college education, I don't recall a single moment where somebody helped me to understand how to create successful and healthy relationships. And I was like, if there's one thing in life that would dictate your happiness and success, if there were 5 things, would you put relationships in that category of totally. The top 5 things that dictate your happiness and success? How many,
even professionally, it's exactly. Like one of the top 5 things. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how many jobs are given due to a relationship? How many projects and gigs and contracts are rewarded because of people skills, because of that relationship with another person? I would venture to bet that that's the majority of the way we do business. And not to mention, it's all of our personal lives, and it's, who we're with at home, and it's all these things. And yet, we took psychology, but when did they actually relate any of that to relationship? Did you learn these things in college or anywhere?
Well, I mean, we may have learned some of them in college, but it wasn't in class, right? You learned it by living with roommates. You learned it by being social, by going and hanging out with people, right? And arguably, that is probably one of the biggest values that you get from college. Like, you think about people who are going to go get their Stanford MBA or go to Harvard Business School or whatever. One of the biggest reasons they're going there for is the networking and the relationships, right? Like that is part of the value that you're getting. It's not necessarily the classroom time. We used to struggle with this at Dev Mountain all the time, where you'd have a brilliant person, just like a really sharp individual who learned very, very quickly, was maybe at the top of his class, so to speak, and struggled to get that first job. And why? Well, it's because of the soft skills. It was because of the people skills. He didn't interview well. He didn't know how to sell himself. He was maybe a bit shy, right? And it wasn't just men, women struggled with this too. We struggled with this. It's like, how do we, if they've had a lifetime of not having any clue how to interact with people, how do we, in our 12-week period or our 14-week period or whatever, where we're already packing it full of programming and practices and things like that, how in the world are we going to help them crack the nut on relationships and social skills? It's a real challenge. And so part of it was we had to actually start filtering a little bit more towards people who could communicate well, because if you can't communicate well, it's going to be really tough to get that first gig or that first job.
And that's my issue, was that not only is it being force fed, not only is the content from elementary to university essentially force fed. University, you have some choice over, previously you can have some control over that, but it's garbage. I mean, it's force fed shit that they're putting down your throat. That, not all of it, but like, I learned about volcanoes and earthquakes in my university. It was that was the actual name of the class: earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, if there was a class there that was like relationships 101, I would have been like, dude, that's my elective. That's what I'm taking. So that's part of this issue, is like the actual important things are left out. The knowledge that we're gaining through this educational system is largely theoretical, largely not applied in any way to its practical usage. So the way that you learn psychology is very different in school than the way it's actually applied in the real world. Same thing with accounting. Like, studying accounting was great. It was fun. I loved it. I love seeing what a business does, overall. But doing it at Ernst & Young bore no semblance to actually studying it in class. I mean, I remember my first year at that job, I thought I was going to get fired every day because I had no clue what I was doing. And I was like, how do I have an accounting degree and have no clue what I'm doing at this job? Like, that doesn't compute for me. So no. I just don't get it. And it's like, there's not. So when you went and you created Dev Mountain, and I said, I'm going to create my own. I literally made our own business education, our own sales education, our own photography education, and everything because of this frustration. And now I'm like, photography's been a medium for me. All I want to do is create educational frameworks that matter. And I don't want to do it in photography. So that's what I'm branching out and saying relationships is the next thing. And then I actually want to do sales. I want to do business. I want to do communication. I want to do each of these different topics. But I asked Clark too. I'm like, how do you address this? And it was like, I asked Clark another question. We can talk gaming in a second, but I was like, how are there all these fantastic games, and yet when we look at like educational games, I want to blow my brains out. Like they're like the worst. Like, can't we give kids something that's both fun and educational? But like the games that they get are like, they lose attention, like their interest in them so quickly.
Yeah.
And then I think StarCraft.
Well, I mean, you take StarCraft as an example, right? I think part of it is recognizing the education inherent in games, and not just educational games. I'm talking about any games. Like, you look at StarCraft, for example, there are a ton of lessons and things that you can learn about the dynamics. And it's a very complex game. It's a very complex
moving
system.
Chess. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's like 3D moving real-time chess. And to be able to pull some of those things out and really understand them is a part, I think, could be a really part of the educational experience. I think what we've tried to do in educational games so often is we've taken the model, which frankly isn't great, and we've now packaged that into another medium, which is games, which doesn't really compute well with that model in the first place, right? And so it doesn't oftentimes yield to very good educational games. So here's another funny story kind of related to education and games and this idea of motive or desire. My friend who started this venture that I'm in right now with kids education, he taught after school coding classes to kids. So he learned computer programming. He wanted to teach his son, but he kind of was like, hey, why don't we just get a bunch of kids in the community together and I'll do an after school class and we'll all learn together, kind of a lab format. And so he would have kids, junior high or sixth graders or whatever, coming into this after school lab, and they'd be complaining about their math class. Like, oh, I hate math. It's awful. It's the worst. Math sucks. And we've all heard this. We've all felt like math is the worst. Then they would come in and sit at their computers and they would do math like 2 grade levels above their grade to be able to build their game, because it was motivating for them. Like they were doing trigonometry to figure out how to position a bullet or a projectile in their game. And guess what? If you sat them in a classroom and said, you're going to learn trigonometry today, it's like, oh, I roll. Like, I don't want to do this. The last thing I want to do. Right. And so like taking, like you talked about earlier, the theory, the danger of taking everything back to its theory is that there's no context. And if there's no context, like where's the motivation to learn this thing? Like, do I really, this actually is what scared me away from computer science in the beginning, was because I'm like, well, I really like computers and maybe I should get into computer science. And then I looked at the class titles and I was like, dude, these sound so boring. It's like logarithm design, or, it was like algorithm design, logarithmic function, whatever. And I'm just like, that sounds like crap that I do not want to learn. Turned out it was actually super interesting stuff, but I had no context for why I needed to learn that. And so therefore I had no motivation to learn it. And I mean, you can talk about the good and the bad of video games all day long. And there's good and bad, but video games do a very good job of providing you motivation to learn a specific set of skills, or a system, or the incentives that are required to participate in the game. Video game designers are very, very good at that kind of stuff. We just haven't really figured out how to apply that same incentives, that motivation, back to things that matter for your day-to-day life.
Well, it's interesting. I believe in Finland, and education has been one of the things that I've studied quite a bit too. And in Finland, I believe they have it pretty close to at least much better dialed in, where like there's no homework. The class durations are short. You're encouraged to essentially go and find interest and find hobbies. And then they essentially relate the context to the things that you enjoy doing. But the classroom sizes are also much smaller. There's definitely much better funding. And the funny thing is that when it comes to test taking, these students are actually some of the smartest in the world. They're some of the best test takers. They actually know their stuff, because again, if you want to build a game and you got to learn math to get there, then it's no longer boring, and it's no longer, something that there's no purpose to it. But even subjects like history, I was like, history is so brilliant. Like, it's such a fantastic subject and topic. How is it so royally effed up in our educational system where we call it social studies, and it's everybody's most dreaded class.
Yeah.
But as an adult, I'm like, it's fascinating. It's like, if you had a Netflix writer that actually wrote the content for a history class, you'd be like, oh my God, this is blowing my mind. But it's the same stuff. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me. Can you tell us about, by the way, this new venture that you have going on? Can we pull it up?
Yeah.
If you can't talk about it yet, that's okay too.
No, it totally can. So it's called Prenda, Prenda. Prenda.co is the website. So basically the whole premise here is just like Airbnb taught us that, redirects to prendaschool.com. Just like Airbnb taught us that anybody can be a hotel, and Uber taught us that anybody can be a taxi. The premise here is that anybody can be a school. Like, any mom can teach 8 to 10 kids from her own living room, and can approach them with a model that actually kids really, really thrive in and love and just get really excited about. So it's still early on,
about, dude.
Yeah. So it's still early on, and we're only in one state right now, just because, regulatory hurdles and things like that. It's tricky to set up a school and make sure you have it set up right and you have the funding correct and everything. But it's a lot of fun. And I used to ask myself,
pull that back up. Look at,
I used to ask
sorry to
myself
interrupt you, dude, but look at
you're good.
In our philosophy, I did not plan this. I did not say, let's get on this call and talk about this stuff, but You've literally dialed in like our philosophy. We focus on problem solving, communication, goal setting, growth mindset, teamwork, self-directed learning, and creativity. At the core, we invite them to see themselves as learners. This is exactly this wasn't planned, but it feels like we planned this.
The universe brought us together yet again, Pi.
Well, one day we are going to work on a project together. So keep going now. So you're only in one state in Utah, I assume.
Oh yeah. No, actually it's in Arizona.
Arizona.
So the original, the founder, Kelly Smith, was teaching these coding classes in Arizona. It's a really cool story that relates to exactly what we're talking about in a couple of different ways. First of all, he was realizing that without kids being motivated, there is no education. Like this idea of I can teach you something is a myth unless you also, as the learner, accept the fact that you want to learn something, right? And so that was one of his first kind of pillars of the philosophy was, look, unless we recognize agency as a part of the process, none of this is going to work. And so in the context of coding clubs, he was creating these coding clubs around the state. And it was really popular. I mean, obviously, parents see computer programming as this valuable skill. Kids are excited to be able to build games. So there was all these, great elements. And so he said, well, let's use public libraries and let's create these after-school coding programs in these public libraries all around the state. And we'll try to find programmers that live in the local area to come and teach these classes. Because his assumption was computer programmers are needed to teach the classes because they know the content. They've got to be able to transmit from their brains to the kids' brains. And he found this fascinating thing, which was, so there was this library that was kind of out, in a rural area. There were no programmers anywhere close by. And he was like, I'm sorry, I can't support you. The librarians were like, we really want to do this. He's like, I'm sorry, I can't find anybody to teach the class. And they're like, well, what if you send us the curriculum and we just teach it? And he's kind of like, okay, good luck. Like, 60-year-old librarians, go for it. And that class actually had some of the highest satisfaction rating. Like the kids in that class were really thriving. And why was that? Well, it was because the kids were left to themselves in large part. And the teacher, instead of playing the role as I am the source of knowledge, learn from me, it was like, hey, how can I help you? What can I do to mentor you, to guide you, to be your cheerleader, to get through this problem and figure out the answer, right? Because guess what? It's not my job to solve the problems for you. You're going to have to solve these problems. And so I'm just here to motivate you and help you and encourage you and help you set goals, right? And so that was really one of the foundational pieces that he discovered was actually having somebody in the room that's not a quote unquote teacher, but really just a caring adult who wants to see you succeed and helps motivate you and doesn't necessarily have all the answers is one of the most powerful things you can have, because we live in an information age. Nobody has to be like the bottleneck for knowledge. Like we don't need to depend on any one human to teach us just about anything unless you're like the only scientist in your field that does X, Y, and Z. You can find just about anything you need on the internet, right? Or it's just out there. The information is there, but it's the motivation that you need to want to learn it. And then it's the discipline and the goal setting and the stick-to-itiveness that it takes to get through that, the determination. So that's really the teacher's job in our minds, is to help these kids to obviously be safe and treat each other with respect, but then to like set goals for themselves and to believe in themselves and to see themselves as learners and not just objects to sort of be acted upon, right? I can sit at the back of the room and let education happen to me. So yeah, that's really the premise behind Prenda. And multiple times at Dev Mountain, I would like stop and turn to somebody and say like, oh my gosh, if we could just help kids to start thinking like this when they were kids, this would be so much easier. Because the first 2 to 3 weeks of Dev Mountain was always untraining people from their academic bad habits, right? Meaning like they would come into class and they would just kind of sit there and expect education to happen to them. It was like, all right, teach me to be a software developer. And I'm just going to sit here. And if I sit here long enough, and if I come to class every day, I will eventually just magically transform into a software developer. And in the first 2 weeks were us telling them, no, that's not how it works. You have to actually challenge yourself. It's like going to the gym and saying, personal trainer, like, all right, personal trainer, I'm just going to lay here, turn me into a bodybuilder. Like it doesn't work that
fitness.
Way. Yeah. Make me fitness. So like, and it's very easy to see in like physical fitness, but if you don't put in the work, guess what? It's just not going to happen. It's very similar with learning. So anyway, we're trying to design this model around some of those concepts of agency, motivation, kids seeing themselves as learners and taking ownership of their journey. And guess what? Turns out that if you take a kid and help them see that math isn't this hard thing for smart people, But math is just something that they have the ability to learn. It just depends on how much they want to learn and how fast. Once they realize they're truly in charge and an adult's not going to sit over their shoulder and tell them what they need to do, they'll learn math way faster than when they're in a classroom with 30 other kids. We've seen kids jump multiple grade levels a year in math because once they truly take ownership and feel the ownership and the rewards that come from learning something, it's like, I actually can be good at math, and maybe math isn't for the smart people. It's for me too. And maybe I'm smart, right? It's like these fundamental assumptions that they started to believe about themselves start to turn into positive self-beliefs. And then it's like, man, the sky's the limit. And if kids come into a Dev Mountain with that kind of mindset, they're going to do really well. Like they already have those abilities, those skills. They're going to apply themselves and they can learn anything they want.
Okay. So I have an idea, but I'm going to need you to sign an NDA.
Okay. Shoot it over in a DocuSign and I'll sign it right away.
Okay. So check this out. The way that I envision, because one of the major issues in the educational system now is that if you have a classroom of 30 students, like how do you incorporate a curriculum that has freedom and flexibility in it? Like it's very challenging and very difficult. So I understand that side. So my perspective on this was, okay, obviously class sizes do need to be reduced, budgets do need to be increased, and we need to actually respect teachers for the jobs that they do. And that needs to be a bigger piece of taxes and funding. But that piece aside, if let's say I were to create a framework around education, because I think about frameworks literally nonstop, what I would do is I would look at what are like maybe if I could take all of the different industries, all the different possible professions, and maybe group them together into kind of 10 global options. Medicine might include any medicinal pathway that would be involved in that. Let's say that you have like technology as one pathway. Let's say you have like creativity as another pathway. So you basically design 10 pathways. And when you learn math, your classroom size is maybe 10 to 15 people, and each student is allowed to choose math from the pathway that interests them. And they could change this. Like maybe one semester they learn math from the medicinal standpoint, and the next time they learn math from the creative standpoint. But there's a limited number of curriculums. So it's not like, they have to just create an infinite amount of possibilities. But each of these different curriculums has a certain approach to the subject that can relate it to something that they understand or are interested in learning. Now, I was thinking from this side, well, the reason why I'm thinking from this side is because I feel like every topic that's currently taught in school is taught from the perspective of somebody who's going to make it their living and profession to teach that subject. You learn psychology not from the standpoint of somebody who practices it, but you learn it from the standpoint of a professor teaching it. So if you actually stick to psychology all the way through, what you're learning is most similar to simply becoming the teacher as a profession. Yeah. Same thing with math. Like what you're learning in math is not theoretical. I mean, it's not practical. It's theoretical, as if you were going to major in mathematics and teach math. That's what they're designed to emulate, right?
Right.
So what if they were to, do you think a system like that would be doable?
Yeah. I mean, I think about, for me, the important thing was always context and relevance, right? So, and we saw this, the analogy I always used at Dev Mountain was kind of comparing it to a computer science curriculum, and not to bash computer science curriculum because there's a lot of great stuff in there and whatever. So let's say you wanted to learn a new language, Chinese, right? Mm-hmm. So you could do one of two things to learn Chinese, and you could obviously do more than two things. You could do a blend of them, but you could either sit in a classroom for 12 months and learn from a teacher how to speak Chinese, right? And you would try to drill things into your head, and you'd use like flashcards, and you'd take tests and quizzes to check your understanding and all that kind of thing. Or you could move to China and like start speaking Chinese to people. And guess which way you're going to learn faster and retain it better, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious, like the contextualized, like immersion. And so we took a very similar approach at Dev Mountain, which was not that these theoretical things are bad, but if you present these theoretical things outside of context, the chances that they will retain them or even learn them in the first place are very, very low. So do you need to learn how to like sort unsorted lists of integers or objects or things like that, yes, at some point you may need to learn how to do that in your career. But is it better to learn that in the context of a real world problem, or to learn it as a separate theoretical piece, right? So to us, context was always everything. And so the very first week was like, build your first website, like build this, get this thing going, and you're going to find problems along the way that you need to solve. And guess what? As we come across those problems, let's talk about them, and we'll say, here's a classic problem that you need to solve. How do we do this and achieve this outcome? Well, it turns out we need to use this structure, right? We need to use a for loop, or we need to use an if statement, or we need to use whatever. And now it's like, okay, that learning is going to stick because it matters to me. It's the same reason why the kid learning trigonometry and building his game is going to learn and remember that for way longer than learning trigonometry in a geometry class in high school. It's because he cares about learning and has the context to learn it. So for me, I think there's lots of ways to accomplish that. The way we approach it at Prenda is we kind of create 3 different learning modes, and they all kind of span different subjects. So the first part of the day is kind of your academic, rigorous, like challenge yourself part of the day. We call it conquer mode. So the kids come in, they set a goal for themselves in math, right? So let's say math, and they get onto like a Khan Academy, because there's lots of really great tools out there. They get into a Khan Academy, and they need to learn how to do, basic algebra, right? They need to learn how to substitute a variable or whatever. Now, there's a little bit of lack of context there, but it's similar to like reading, or even when you learn Chinese, you didn't just show up in China with no context at all, right? Like you had some basic understandings to be able to use the bathroom and things like that, right? So we give them some context. They spend part of the day just learning and doing some of the academic like grinding that we all have to do to learn things. The second part of the day is a collaborative section where they're sitting with other kids in the room, and they might be doing a science thing together where they're learning about some scientific principle and asking questions. They might be having a Socratic discussion. They might be having a debate. They might be doing like a math puzzle together and like socially, interacting in that way. And you talked about this earlier, kind of this lack of social interaction and these social skills. So much more of social interaction can be embedded in the learning process, and really should be, because guess what?
For sure.
That's one of the ways we learn is through social interaction with other people. So if I'm having to defend a certain side of an argument, or if I'm having to answer a question about why Pac-Man's going to reach the ghost in a certain number of seconds based on his rate of speed, like that is going to stick with me way more than by learning that concept in isolation. And then the third part, which is, I think, also kind of what you're talking about with your model, we call create mode, which is much more free form. Like, what do I want to build? Do I want to be artistic and build some kind of physical sculpture? And I'm going to learn about what materials I need to use and like what colors mix with different colors, and kind of take a more artistic approach to it. Or am I going to build a robot? Am I going to build like a Lego robot, and I've got to understand basics of electricity and different things like that? That creative, like free flowing, like choose your own adventure type learning is really, really important for kids to just stay engaged and really love what they're doing. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't really applied it super well to adult learning. And I think there's lots of ways that we could do it. But I think for me, the concept is always going to be like context is king. And motivation like is a prerequisite, right? For any kind of learning. If you put a child or an adult in a classroom and say, you've got to learn this for the next, 6 weeks or something like that, it's going to be really tough.
Yes. And it seems like you are literally on the same path and doing something about it in creating Prenda. And I hope it takes off. It is exactly what I'm kind of discussing too, is like having contextual approaches to each of the different subjects and allowing a student to actually choose which context. And if those contexts are limited, then it's not so much of a burden on the teacher to know everything. And honestly, I think it would be much easier for the teachers because they don't need to be like, if I'm teaching physics from the standpoint of a practical knowledge, I could do that not knowing anything about physics. Give me the textbooks, give me the understanding of it, and I can teach practical applied physics. But if you want me to teach physics from the standpoint of theoretical, you want to be a physics professor? No. Like the only way I could teach that is if I were to actually go through and get my physics, doctorate and go through and do something. So I do feel like it would solve a lot of those issues. And in the meantime, I'm kind of trying to address that in a much smaller scale, as you are in a sense of like you literally have these classrooms already, which is absolutely awesome. So I'm going to ask you a completely different and unrelated question now, since we did bring up the subject of games a couple times. A little bit more lighthearted. What game are you most looking forward to right now? Do you still play?
Not very much.
What's the game? This is the best question. What's the game that you would actually get back and play?
So going back to your StarCraft comment earlier, every time I get on and play StarCraft for 5 seconds, I just like rage quit. It's like the most embarrassing. I feel like I have no muscular hand-eye coordination, and I'm getting like trash talked by like 12-year-old kids, and I'm just like, this is the worst experience. This is the worst experience ever. At least if you're playing like one-on-one or something like that. And that's for me one of the problems with kind of these like hardcore games like League of Legends or other games like that is like I feel like the learning curve is way too steep for me. And the last thing I want to do is jump in an online game with a bunch of people who are going to hate my guts for the next 10 minutes because I'm going to make them lose in their game or whatever. So StarCraft for me is like still like super interesting and fascinating. I just don't play it really anymore because I guess maybe I'm scared too.
I don't feel bad for you because that was my experience literally every time I played with you. So just for context, we described it a little bit earlier, but StarCraft is a game made by Blizzard Entertainment, and it's a strategy game where basically 2 or more players are essentially you're controlling these armies, and it's tons of hand-eye coordination, a lot like imagine chess but on that 3D game board and amplified to like the nth degree. Like how fast you can actually manipulate and move your pieces is actually a part of this game because it's all real time. There's no turns, there's no nothing. So Kaylin used to be really, really good at StarCraft, and I'll guarantee you're probably still really pretty good at it. But we would hop on and play, and it would be like I played, I think like one game with you, and then it was like, you know what, we might as well do like 3-on-1. Like, so we would play like 3 of us against Kaylin, and he would trounce us. Now to do this, you had to like bounce from like 4 different places in the world, like as he's controlling armies everywhere. It was the most aggravating thing in the world. So rage quit means essentially pounding your keyboard and walking away. and that's the only feeling that I've ever felt playing StarCraft is rage quit nonstop.
Yeah, it is a high stress, not necessarily for beginners type game. So one game I do really enjoy playing, a couple actually from Blizzard that I still play from time to time is Diablo is still super fun. I know you're a Diablo fan.
That's the game I would come back for, Diablo 4.
Yeah, I still play it. In fact, over Christmas break, I fired it up a couple of times and was like, oh, they've added some cool stuff, and actually got into it and played it a little bit with my son one time, and we were just like going through like killing mobs of monsters and leveling up like crazy people. So it was kind of fun. Like I was like, oh, this is cool. The other one that is a good game because it requires like so little. Like the crappy thing about StarCraft is it requires every ounce of your attention and your like mind space. And it literally is an exhausting experience. Like if you're going to play like one-on-one competitive games, it's just this exhausting. And games can go on for 45 minutes, like where you're just pounding and grinding and trying to gain the advantage. So it's very difficult to just jump in and jump out of. Like you've got to dedicate like 2 hours to a StarCraft session. So another game that I like is Hearthstone. You've probably heard of Hearthstone from Blizzard, because it's just way more casual. Like you can play it. And if you're like semi-engaged, it's fine because maybe it's not your turn, whatever. And honestly, like one of the games that I've played the most in the last 5 or 6 years has been chess. I mean, chess is like every game I play, I come back to chess and I'm like, how is this game so freaking brilliant? Like, I mean, I don't know the history of it and who invented it and all that kind of stuff, but I'm like, it is like the perfect game. It has so many amazing elements and it's so complex yet simple enough for a child to understand. And so if you ever want to play with me on chess.com, let me know.
I don't want to play any games with you anymore, ever. Have you watched Queen's Gambit?
I haven't yet. I'm really excited to watch it. I actually watched, me and my kids watched another Netflix show the other day that was about chess. I can't remember what it was called, but I think you are over inflating your memory of me in StarCraft. I may have been like a decent at some point compared to you, but I remember also playing with you against other people, and you leveled up very quickly. I don't remember you being like bad at the game.
I was like there are degrees to StarCraft. At the top of the degree chain is Korean. Like it's at the top is a whole race of people. Like is that not like, we would always be like, is it a Korean player? Cause like those guys don't mess around.
Yeah, if there was like Korean symbols in their name, it was like, oh crap, we are gonna get trounced. Yeah,
we're done. There was the newbie, then like maybe the casual. I was probably the casual, and then there was like the, kind of enthusiast, like the serious enthusiast, which I would put you on that level. Then there was the people that were like aspiring pros, and then there were the Koreans. Like that was my stratification. So maybe I was one step above a newbie, but it's a stressful game, man. And I find that like, I didn't used to feel that when I played like earlier games like Warcraft and StarCraft, but when I started playing with you and you kind of like, you start the game out and you're building up like this army and this base. And then Kalen, the asshole, would just bring his army in and like start trashing all your buildings. And you're like, I just built those and I liked the way I built them and how they were organized. Hey, and you're like walking through and destroy. And like, there's a real sense of like anxiety that comes with that. And it's similar to the same feeling of like chess. Like you get the same when someone like takes a really critical piece and you didn't expect it, you're like, oh, you get that sinking feeling. Which
at least with chess, you have this time to like think about it though. Yes. And if you missed a move, it's because you just didn't think hard enough about it. But with StarCraft, it's like, oh, they're just faster. Like they're just faster at like hand-eye coordination and thinking than I am. I always felt whenever I played that game years ago, I always felt like I needed to fork my brain into like multiple threads to be successful. It was like, I've got to have one part of my brain worried about this thing over here, that my economy. And then I've got another part of my brain building buildings and pumping out guys. And then another part of my brain's like managing armies and, trying to attack people and things like that. The crazy thing about Blizzard or these modern game companies is that they've done such a good job of matching you with similarly leveled players, right? And this is where, for me, I had to actually take a step back from games like StarCraft, was because the addiction for me came from always having another challenge. Like no matter how many times I won, I always, first of all, got the dopamine hit from winning, but then I was always presented with a little bit harder challenge. And for me, somebody like me who, is naturally competitive and likes a challenge, it was like crack, right? It was like, oh man, if I can just beat this person, then it's like another dopamine hit. And if you lose, there's an equal amount of motivation to get better. It's like, oh, I lost, but I can win if I do this, right? And so you're constantly like refining and trying to get better. And it creates this experience eventually where you're just so anxious and you're so invested that you're not even like really having fun. I think like, I think there's something to be said for like these casual games where you don't have to be like professional or like really, really good at it to enjoy it. And those are the games that I like to play.
I mean, that goes for a lot of things in life. I feel like, well, one thing, as you're describing it, I was thinking of, there's studies that are done that have looked at professional chess players, and in their senior years, like, 20, 30 years after they've become masters, and, it's not even long after they become masters, essentially, they develop psychological problems. So they develop these exaggerated sense of paranoia and all these different things, because in your brain, you are nonstop thinking of what could go wrong. Like if you're a chess player, you're thinking of every possible move, so you basically have this one muscle that thinks of worst case scenarios, and you're working out that muscle nonstop. So it becomes the strongest piece of your psyche. And they would like develop schizophrenia and paranoia and all these different like issues. And I'm kind of thinking back to StarCraft. I'm like, that has to be infinitely more stressful. And I wonder what these professional gamers are going to do with their mental health as they go forward. But what you said about being casual, I tell photographers this a lot, and to bring this back into kind of some of the stuff that we were discussing, is there's a huge difference in approaching something from the standpoint of enjoyment and casually participating versus making it your profession. I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, it's one of my favorite things in the world. I have my whole family enrolled in it. And I do it outside of COVID. I do it, 5 times a week. But if you were to tell me, like, you're going to make a living doing this, it would lose all of its joy and fulfillment, because then there comes that pressure of like, okay, well now I got to compete. And if I'm going to compete, I got to win. And if I lose, then I got to go back harder. And it becomes this thing where a game, photography, jujitsu, programming, like you can do any of these things from the standpoint of enjoyment. But at a certain point, there's a line that you cross where it's like, is this still a game? Is it still a hobby? Or am I like crossing into semi-professional, territory? So totally. It's a weird thing.
Well, this is something that I think is relevant today. I've heard a couple of, we do this funny thing where we always like listen to thought leaders. Like Twitter's full of this. It's like, oh, somebody said something really brilliant. Let's retweet them 12 million times. And now it's like they have the wisdom. But one of the things I've seen kind of make the rounds recently is, so you have these competing narratives of like follow your passion or like don't follow your passion. Like following your passion is stupid because like you're gonna end up in a place where you're trying to be a professional jujitsu player, right? Or follow your passion and like everything's gonna work out. And obviously it's not that simple. Like you can't just like paint those two opposites and say one is right and one is wrong. It completely depends on like what it is you're trying to do. If you're super passionate, I mean, part of it is you have to understand like the bounds of what it is that you're doing, right? Like if I love games and I'm excited to be a gamer and I'm like, this is my passion, right? Like I want to be a professional gamer. You probably better do some research and understand what that actually means. Like, does that mean that I can, is it that I enjoy playing games, or is it that I want to be the best gamer in the world, right? Because those are two very different things. Like you said, casual hobby, side project, fun pastime versus like, this is what I'm going to dedicate my life to. And we get those mixed up so often. And for me, it was important even with Dev Mountain, where I realized that, for me, education was always something I was super passionate about. So it was like, okay, this is a part of my life where I can marry what I do every day to a passion that I have. That's anytime I can do that. Yes. Like, please, because it's going to make work not feel like work anymore. And for Dev Mountain, it was also like technology and engineering and building things, which is also something I love to do. So like the marriage of those two together seemed like, oh, this is great. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And not all hobbies, not all activities are like that. And sometimes it's just taking a couple of steps back and saying, well, what is it that I really enjoy about this activity, right? It may not be that actual game. It might be competition. And it may not be competition. It may be solving problems or thinking quickly or like adapting to situations, like understanding like the meta level of what it is that you're passionate about and what you enjoy can make it applicable to so many different fields. So you don't have to feel like, oh, I have to be a gamer or a firefighter or a computer engineer. Like there's so many different variations of those that we get so caught up on, follow your passion, don't follow your passion, that kind of thing.
I agree with you, and I'm somewhere in between, although I will completely own up that I hate the term passion, not because it's wrong, but because we use it in the wrong context. Like nobody talks about passion in what it really is. You were passionate about education so much so that you were also passionate about the process of building what it was that you were creating. And that's the piece that I think that's left out of the passion discussion is like, are you passionate for the result or are you passionate about the process? Because if you don't have that, like if you don't have enough passion to also bring the process into it, you're never going to get to the result. It's never going to be even on the table. You're going to be 10 years away from it before you quit, or when you quit, So that's my side of it, is like, I do feel like people need to choose what they do. When you say like at that meta level, I think core values, like we need to pick and choose those things that align with us and to actually understand what it is that you value in a particular exercise. But whatever somebody jumps into from the standpoint of like passion, or especially when a standpoint of like a profession, goodness, I hope you have researched and you are passionate about every step leading up to that result, because like you can love video games. I'm sorry, being a programmer of video games has nothing in common with loving them.
Yes.
Like those two are not, and I learned that when I was 19 and at Acclaim. I was like, I love video games. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And it took me like 3 months to be like, nope, I'm done.
Yep.
Like,
Turns out working on them is not nearly as fun as playing them, right?
Yes.
And I experienced a little bit of what you're talking about at Dev Mountain, where, for one of the first times in my life, I felt like I was working on something that was exciting. So entrepreneurship is always exciting and fun, and I was into that. Education, it's like check, and then technology, check. I was like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. I cannot see myself doing anything else than what I'm doing right now, which at the time early on was teaching and building better curriculum and trying to make a better experience and just like having fun the whole time.
Yeah.
And I truly believed that would be the last thing I was ever going to do. Last thing I would ever do. Fast forward a few years and I was completely burned out. Like I had taught, hundreds of people, and a lot of it was still very fulfilling and rewarding, but I'd gotten to the point where now I was running a business. I was no longer actually on the front lines of education. I was like helping hire the people and manage the people who hired the people who taught, right? Yep. It was like I was multiple levels away from the experience. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this at Lynn and Jirsa too, where, in the beginning, you guys were out doing all of these photo shoots and everything. And that changes over time. Like now you're doing a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yep, that's a natural progression of any business.
And so it's like, it's not just, do I enjoy this and do I want to do this every day? For me, it was like, that was part of the reason why it made sense for me to sell at the time, was I wasn't super interested in running that particular business anymore. It was fun and I had a great ride doing it. And guess what? I still love teaching and I still love technology. And I would even like totally be okay going back and teaching some classes, but like running the business is totally different than like doing the day-to-day stuff that I was doing.
For sure, man. So tell me this, you have Prenda, but what else is on the horizon? Are you full-time on Prenda, or is that?
Yeah, I've been working on Prenda full-time for almost 2 years. And I was kind of involved with Kelly early on, just like advisor/investor for the first year, and then joined on full-time with him a couple years ago. So yeah, going to see it through. We've taken the venture funding route this time because we just, for multiple reasons. But it's been fascinating. It's been fun. We're growing like crazy. It's now to the point where like it's a business and we're like hiring and managing people rather than like doing some of the frontline stuff, but I'm actually enjoying it a lot more this time, having learned a lot, and I'm still learning a lot, but it's great.
Well, man, I could talk to you forever, dude. We have still so much to catch up on, and I feel like maybe we can put a little to be continued in this conversation, and in a few months bring you back on, and let's carry on.
Let's do it. Totally down. Right, I'll get a better mic. You got like this awesome, sexy setup, and I'll be honest, I'm not even wearing pants or anything. I think that's like the
stand up, please. Can you stand up?
Actually, I do have sweatpants on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. My camo sweatpants on, so not quite as bad as pantless.
You know what? Given circumstances in 2020, it's all good, man. It's all good. No expectations whatsoever. No, I appreciate you coming on, man. For all of our listeners, well, I guess the Dev Mountain is the thing that you have created and now you have sold off, but that's still a fantastic place to learn coding, is it not? Would be the. I honestly still actually want to go to one of your boot camps. I'm hoping that it's still like your curriculum if I ever get the chance to do this, but that was like one of the things that I wanted to do. Meantime, though, what about Prenda? Can they check out Prenda? Like, is there anything that our audience can do on that side?
Yeah, so it's still really, in the state of Arizona, we have a large network of micro schools and it's growing a lot, and we're looking at getting a new state. So there's not a ton from kind of the send your kid to a publicly funded micro school yet. We do have a homeschool product, which a lot of parents are looking at alternative forms of education more so in the last couple of years than they have ever. So that's been pretty popular. But I guess a big part of it is just like learn more about micro schools. I think that's the biggest thing, is like, Prenda is kind of a movement and micro schooling is a movement, and hopefully we'll be in a lot more states soon. So
yeah, I hope you guys make it out to California soon, because that sounds fantastic. I would totally get my kids into that. So yeah. Appreciate you, man. We'll bring you back on sometime soon. We'll chat more.
Cool. Thanks, man. Great to catch up.
All right, brother.